In May of 1984, I stood on the bluff near Fog Harbor and watched the school bus fade into the mist like it was never there to begin with. 10 kids on board, all of them heading to a college fair up in Portland. The bus didn't crash. It didn't call in. It just vanished. And by the time we realized what had happened, it was already too late. 40 years passed. People forgot. But then someone found the roof buried under a barn in Barrow Hollow, and that's when the silence started to crack. Before we start, subscribe to help uncover stories they tried to bury, and make sure no name stays forgotten. My name's Emery Thorne. I was born and raised in coastal Maine just north of Barrow Hollow. These days I'm retired mid-60s, live alone on the edge of Fog Harbor where the wind never really stops. But back then I was 26, fresh badge, still learning how to wear it. Back then I believed in structure. I believed in procedure and routine. Kids rode their bikes down Main Street after dark. Neighbors left their doors unlocked. The fog rolled in most mornings, but we knew its rhythm. It came and went like tides never stayed long. I'd been on the force less than a year when it happened. It started the way any school day might, just quieter. The fog had come in earlier than usual that morning, low, heavy, no breeze behind it. I remember walking out to the cruiser and feeling like the whole town had hit mute. No birds, no footsteps, just this thick, gray stillness hanging in the streets. Bus number 78 was scheduled for a special trip that day. 10 seniors from Fog Harbor High, bright kids, National Honor Society science team, a couple athletes. The principal called it a symbolic send-off. Their families packed them breakfast bags waved from porches. They were headed to a college fair in Portland, just an overnight nothing fancy. The chaperone drove separately. And Gil Mason, he was the driver. If you ask anyone who lived here back then, they'll remember Gil. He was dependable. Quiet man, mid-50s widower. Drove the same route every morning, same thermos in his hand, same butterscotch candies in his shirt pocket. Never raised his voice. Never missed a day. I saw him that morning in the school lot. Bus idling, windows fogged, kids climbing aboard through the mist like shadows. Jessica Mayhew, Sam Delaney, Brandon Vale. I knew most of them. Small town, everybody knows everybody. The last to get on was someone I didn't recognize. Young man, slender build, dark coat. He didn't look up, just took the back seat and stared straight ahead. By 6:21 a.m., the doors closed. The bus pulled out and disappeared into the fog, heading south along the coast road. That was the last time anyone saw them. Now none of us panicked right away. It's a 2-hour drive to Portland. Traffic delays, road construction. These things happen. But by 9:00 a.m., the chaperone was calling the fair organizers asking if the bus had checked in. By 9:15, the school was on the line with the county. By 10:30, I was standing with a dozen officers on the cliffs overlooking mile marker 17, where a fisherman said he saw the bus glide into the fog and never come out the other side. But that part of the story, what came next, I'll get to that in time. Right now, I want you to understand what the town felt like just before. Everything was intact. The high school still had its old scoreboard. Main Street had the same barber poles spinning out front. Every Sunday, Miss Langford baked her cinnamon rolls and sold them out of her porch window. It was a normal place. But that week, the fog never lifted. 3 days before the bus disappeared, I remember my radio cutting in and out. Static in shortwave bands, dogs barking at windows. A streetlight near the school started flickering, then went out completely. No one thought anything of it. Why would they? But then, on the night before the trip, something odd came across the precinct desk. An anonymous tip. Just a few words scribbled on a torn envelope. There'll be 11. No return address. No explanation. No name. We didn't know what it meant. We logged it like we always did, filed it, forgot it. The next morning, 10 students boarded a school bus, and one of them wasn't supposed to be there. At first, we told ourselves it was just a delay. Fog like that could slow a trip down by hours. Roads along the coast are narrow, winding, and when visibility drops below 100 feet, even the most careful driver can lose time. Gil Mason was nothing if not careful. I waited most of that morning inside the station, listening to dispatch check and recheck arrival logs from the college fair in Portland. By 9:12 a.m., the chaperone had called the school asking where the bus was. By 9:16, Principal Yates was on the line with our department. At 9:45, I was already at the cliffs off mile marker 17 with 2 patrol cars, a set of binoculars, and a sinking feeling that something was very wrong. There were no signs of a crash, no skid marks, no broken rail, no scraped paint. Just the same thick fog rolling over the bluffs and down into the sea. Cold, quiet, heavy. A fisherman out near the drop said he saw the bus just past 720 yellow lights floating through the mist. He swore it stayed steady, never swerved, never sped up. Then it vanished. Never came out the other side. By noon, we had helicopters circling the coast and dive teams checking the tide pools below. We dragged the inlets. We walked every ditch between Fog Harbor and Route 1. Nothing. No oil on the water, no glass on the rocks, not even a torn scrap of fabric, like the whole thing had been swallowed. Families started showing up at the station that afternoon. Parents, siblings, teachers, each of them asking the same questions we didn't have answers to. Why hadn't the bus called in? Could it have turned around? Did they take a wrong road? And then when none of those stuck? What if Gil had done something? People didn't say it out loud at first, but you could feel the suspicion settling under their voices. He was alone with those kids. He had access. Maybe he snapped. Maybe he drove off the cliff on purpose. But no one really believed that, not the ones who knew him, not me. 4 days later, the Coast Guard recovered a single shoe near Widow's Cove. It was lodged in the reeds, waterlogged and torn. When the lab matched it to Rachel Penn, the energy in town shifted. We'd found something, but we hadn't, because that was all there was. No trace of Rachel herself, no blood, no DNA, just the shoe. And without a vehicle, without bodies, we were stuck. We couldn't rule it an accident, couldn't file it as a crime. So the state listed it as an open disappearance, which to most of us just meant closed with paperwork. They held a vigil on the cliffs that weekend. 10 crosses planted in the soil. Gil's was smaller. Some folks thought he didn't deserve one. Others thought his should have been the tallest. But by the following spring, his wife had packed up and left town without a word. I never saw her again. We carved the kids' names into a slab of granite and mounted it into the east wall of the gym. 10 names, 10 fates, and underneath them the words, "The Fog Harbor 10. May you never be forgotten." But memory is slippery. By the 3rd year, no one talked about it. By the 5th, new teachers avoided the topic. By the 10th, most students passed that plaque without looking. We had our explanations, unofficial ones. Sinkholes, cults, sea caves, government experiments. I heard them all, but I never believed any of them. I believed in the bus. I believed in Gil. And I believed something had taken them. I just didn't know what. That changed on August 12, 2024. A construction crew was clearing an old barn site in Barrow Hollow, 40 miles inland, not even in the original search radius. They were prepping to pour a new foundation when one of the backhoes scraped across a rusted sheet of metal, a corroded roof panel, yellow paint beneath layers of dirt. The number stamped into it was faint but clear enough. District 23, bus number 78. I drove up from Fog Harbor myself. When I arrived, the barn was half demolished. The ground was soft with churned soil. They'd cordoned off the area, brought in state forensics. As I crossed the tape, I spotted the edge of the panel. I knew it before I touched it. The shape, the color, the emergency hatch torn from its hinges. That roof hadn't collapsed. It had been buried. Deliberately. On purpose. A few feet away, they'd uncovered a varsity jacket sealed in a plastic bag still marked with Brandon Vale's name stitched on the inside collar. No one could explain how a piece of the coast road had ended up under a barn so far inland, but I knew what it meant. That bus didn't go into the sea. It didn't crash. It had been moved, covered, hidden. I stood over the slab and felt something I hadn't felt in decades, certainty. That bus never left land. It was taken, and someone didn't want it found. Back at the precinct, Officer Mila Gordon had already pulled up a digital scan of the jacket. She was newer to our department, sharp, quiet, the kind who thought before she spoke. We went through the evidence together. Jacket roof panels, soil samples, photographs. One in particular stood out, a black and white image from a 1992 zoning report. The barn before collapse. In the background, a man stood behind a fence. Not close, not clear, but his posture was wrong. Too still, too focused. Just far enough in shadow to make his face unreadable. When we enhanced the contrast, Mila caught something behind him. Just a curve of metal barely visible through the weeds. Yellow, arched. The roof was already buried back then, which meant whoever that man was, he knew. I told Mila I wanted everything on that property owner. Tax records, old leases, utility bills. She nodded. And the man in the photo, she asked. Find him, I said. That night I drove out to the school. It had been shuttered for years. Paint-peeling doors, chained windows, dusted in salt. I walked through the gym past the memorial, and something made me stop. A scratch on the edge of the plaque. Fresh, clean. Just a letter E. It wasn't part of the engraving. Someone had carved it in. Back at the station, I pulled the original trip manifest. 10 students, 10 names, all accounted for, but something didn't sit right. I went down into archives, pulled the 1984 yearbook. Page by page, I matched names to faces. Jessica, Sam, Carla, Brandon, Rachel. But then, near the back, a single name stood alone. No photo, no quote, just text. Eddie Caldwell, transfer student, spring semester. I didn't remember him. None of the parent statements mentioned him. He wasn't on any permission slip, but his name was written by hand on the trip roster. The secretary who filed it passed away in the early 90s. There was no way to ask why she included him. Digging deeper, I found that Eddie had been living with an uncle on Creighton Street, a man named Raymond Caldwell. I don't remember him at any meetings, never answered the school's calls. The house sold 2 days after the bus vanished. No forwarding address. The utilities were cut off that same week. The bank account closed. Gone. I sat in my office for a long time, staring at the manifest. 10 kids were remembered. 10 names etched into stone. 10 families stood in that gym begging for answers. But there had been 11 on that bus. One of them arrived quietly. One of them disappeared without a sound. And that meant only 2 possibilities. Either Eddie Caldwell was just another forgotten victim, or he was the reason no one ever came back. I didn't say anything at first. Not to the department, not to the press, not even to the families who still sent emails every year asking if there was any new development. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't prove what I was thinking, and in this kind of work you don't raise your hand unless you're sure. A kid like Eddie Caldwell, no photo in the yearbook, no digital footprint, no next of kin. Someone like that can disappear into a file cabinet forever, especially when no one's looking for him. And the truth is, no one was. The town had built its narrative around 10. 10 students, 10 chairs, 10 plaques. 11 was a number nobody wanted to hold. I tried to bring it up carefully at the weekly status meeting. Told the chief we might have missed someone in the original trip manifest, mentioned that the student roster had a name that didn't match any permission slip. He looked at me like I was dragging a dead theory out of the ground for attention. We combed all that he said. Let it lie. Even Mila, who'd backed me on everything up to that point, paused before speaking. "You think he was just forgotten?" she asked. "Or are you saying he never existed?" I told her I didn't know. Not yet. But I couldn't stop seeing that name handwritten on the trip sheet tucked into a file where it didn't belong. I remembered the way it looked like someone added it after the fact. Slightly darker ink, tilted like it had been squeezed into the space. It wasn't a printout. It wasn't formal. It looked more like a placeholder. I went back to the school building later that week, pulled open the basement records myself. The boxes down there hadn't been touched in years. You could smell the mildew before the stairs even leveled out. I found the 1984 drawer and pulled the folder labeled College Fair, May 11th. The permission slips were still in order. 10 names, 10 signatures, all dated and verified. But stuck behind them, folded and damp, was a photocopy of a spring semester class schedule. Room 206 had an extra student penciled in at the bottom. Caldwell E., no date, no approval signature, just a name written in the margins. Back at the station, Mila was still at her desk going over soil samples from the barn site. She didn't say anything when I walked in, just handed me a printout and said, "You need to read this." It was a government form. The heading was mostly redacted, but I could make out enough. Project Covicus, Phase 1 Trial, Closed Circuit Observation, Educational Unit, Fog Harbor Branch. At the bottom, beneath a line of blacked-out content, one sentence stood out. All data to be returned to Division Lead via Caldwell Conduit. I sat down without realizing it. I'd been asking the wrong questions. Eddie Caldwell wasn't just a missing name. He was the delivery system. That night, just before dawn, we drove out to Camden. There was one person I hadn't talked to in decades. Thomas Penn, Rachel's brother. He'd been 11 when she vanished. Now he was in his 50s, living alone in a second-floor apartment above a closed hardware store. The number on the door was missing a nail. He opened it before I even knocked. Said, "You're here about the bus," like he'd been waiting. Inside, every wall was covered in canvases. Faces, half-formed stairwells, choked in fog, a yellow bus parked in a room with no doors. One painting showed 10 kids standing in a circle, all holding hands. In the center was a black figure with no eyes. Thomas didn't look at me when he spoke. "She told me what it looked like," he said. "Rachel. She never came back, not really, but I still heard her. In the floorboards, in the walls. She used to whisper to me when I was a kid." He tapped the side of his head with a paint-streaked finger. I thought it was dreams, but it wasn't. I laid the Polaroid on the table, the one we pulled from the crate beneath the barn. 10 students lined up inside a concrete room, faces pale, clothes dirty, numbers scribbled in pen below each chin. Subject 1, Jessica. Subject 2, Sam. Subject 3, Carla, and so on. Subject 10's face had been scratched out. Behind them, near the shadows, stood the 11th figure. Still, watching. "That's them," Thomas said. "That's all of them. Except that one. He wasn't supposed to be there. Rachel told me he was already on the bus when they got on, just sitting in the back. Nobody saw him get picked up, but she remembered, said he watched them sleep. We stayed for an hour, maybe 2. He never raised his voice, never asked what we were doing. When we left, he pointed to the window and said, "She came to me once, on my birthday. I was awake. I know I was." She stood there and whispered, "They let him in, but he never left." I asked if she gave him a name. He didn't hesitate. Caldwell. Back at the station, I reopened every mention of the Caldwell family in town records. There was almost nothing. No birth certificate, no insurance, no school files from before that semester. The man he'd lived with, Raymond Caldwell, was a name on a deed and not much else. The house had burned down in the 90s. No foul play, no injuries. The fire report said faulty wiring. When the owner passed away a few years later, nobody claimed the ashes. I went back through every audio log we'd pulled from the site. The cassette marked Phase 1. Caldwell had a clipped, flat voice. Young, maybe, but not innocent. Subject 3 has stopped eating. Subject 6 hums during sleep. Subject 10 requested paper and pencil. Permission denied. That voice wasn't frightened. It was observant, detached, documenting collapse like someone monitoring mice in a cage. I told Mila it sounded more like a handler than a victim. She nodded and handed me a scanned file. It was an application form dated 1984 student enrollment. Caldwell Edward, block capitals. No family contacts. At the bottom, in red pen, monitor carefully. If integration fails, initiate withdrawal. No post-contact with subjects. Return to division lead. Barrow Hollow Site 7. We'd found a roof, a jacket, a notebook. But now we knew what we hadn't found: an entire facility. Something built, used, and buried. That night I returned to the barn alone. The fog was thick again, thicker than it had been in weeks. I parked beside the fencing and walked the perimeter, ground still soft from the excavation. The hatch they'd cut into the slab was still open. The stairs led down into the cold like a mouth. I stepped inside. The crates had been removed, evidence processed, but the shape of the room remained. You could see where the cot had been bolted down, where a wire once ran across the ceiling, where hands had scratched at the walls. In the far corner, just out of reach from the overhead light, I found it. A child's drawing etched into the concrete. 10 stick figures in a line, and beneath them 4 words scratched deep enough to crack the surface. We weren't all students. I stood there longer than I should have. Let the quiet settle. Let the cold move through my sleeves. Then I turned off my flashlight just for a second. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to feel what they felt. That dark, that silence, that presence. Back on the surface, the wind had picked up. I crossed the site slowly. No sounds but grass moving. No lights but the one at the edge of the field. But the thought followed me. If Eddie Caldwell had been planted, if someone had built that room, if those kids were chosen, then what else had been left out of the story? And what if he wasn't the only one who got on that bus? I kept thinking about that drawing. 10 stick figures carved into concrete, 1 line of jagged words beneath them. We weren't all students. I didn't know whose hand had scratched it or when, but it hadn't been part of the official file. It wasn't mentioned in the evidence tags. Whoever found it hadn't logged it, maybe didn't think it mattered. But I knew better. That room beneath the barn, it wasn't just a burial site. It had been active, lived in, observed, and someone inside had tried to leave a message. I'd spent most of my career working cases with a start and a finish. Victims, suspects, a motive that made sense. But this thing, whatever it was, never played by those rules. It didn't want credit. It didn't leave prints. It didn't follow any pattern that a sane person could track. It just lingered. In the days after the hatch was uncovered, I found myself drifting. Not away from the case, but deeper into it. I was still showing up at the station, still briefing Mila and the department. But something had shifted. I stopped answering certain calls. Let the mail pile up. I started eating in my car again, parked out near the cliffs or the old school lot, places where the fog had a rhythm. I was trying to find it again, whatever pulse had threaded through that morning in '84. I reread every statement from the original investigation, every parent interview, every bus log. I watched the drone footage from the barn site over and over until the angles blurred. Mila kept asking what I was looking for. I couldn't answer her because I didn't know. It felt like I was standing in a room with something just behind me. Close enough to feel, but never in view. Late one night, I went back to the evidence board and pulled down the original trip roster. 10 names. I stared at them until the paper started to ripple from the heat of the desk lamp. Then I turned it over. Nothing. Clean. So I pulled the yearbook again, page after page of faded ink and glossy smiles. The same 10 students. Jessica Mayhew in her cheer jacket. Sam Delaney holding a physics trophy. Carla Bridge in that oversized denim coat. And then, at the bottom corner of the final senior, spread a small box with no photo. Eddie Caldwell, transfer student, spring '84. No quote. No clubs. No mention of him in any award section. Just a name tucked into the margins like an afterthought. I ran the address again. Raymond Caldwell, Creighton Street. The lot had been sold for cash 3 days after the bus vanished. No forwarding address. The closing documents were signed, but the notary had since passed away. There was no signature from Eddie himself. I checked the electric company logs. Final bill paid in full. Phone disconnected before police ever visited the property. No neighbors remembered seeing a moving truck. That house and the people tied to it disappeared like dust shaken from a blanket. Mila stayed quiet through most of this. She was careful, methodical. Never pushed. But I could tell she was tracking the same unease. We'd stopped asking whether the bus had crashed. We knew now it hadn't. We'd stopped asking if Gil was responsible. We'd stopped asking about the road, the cliffs, the missing guardrail. The question now was simpler. Who or what else had boarded that bus? We pulled the cassette marked Phase 1. Caldwell again. Cleaned the audio as best we could. The voice was steady, emotionless. Subjects accepting me. Jessica believes I'm just quiet. Sam offered me food. Subject 7 is too observant. Subject 3 is spiraling. Authorization granted to escalate. Then a pause. A long one. When the tape started again, the tone had shifted, less detached, more deliberate. They still think I'm one of them. That's good. That's what we wanted. We found 3 more tapes labeled with dates ranging from May 12th to June 3rd, all in the same voice. Short entries, specific language. Subject 10 remains on alert. Subject 3 attempted non-compliance. Subject 7 asked about external doors, recommend sedation. The language wasn't emotional, it was clinical. Like Caldwell had been trained to study them, not just blend in. Mila said it out loud first. He wasn't a victim, she said. He was staff. That idea settled in the room like smoke. I kept coming back to the photos, especially the one from the zoning inspection. The man in the coat. The one near the fencing. Not close enough to see his face, but in every version we enhanced, there was something in his posture. The way he leaned just slightly toward the lens. He wasn't surprised to be caught. He was watching. We kept digging. Found a group staff photo from a juvenile psych facility that operated upstate until '89. Del Rest Unit 7. A white coat, short hair, badge turned away from the camera. Same build, same face. The name tag was blurred, but Mila flagged the timestamp. March 1984. 2 months before the bus disappeared. On the back of the photo was a list of patient IDs, all redacted, but 2 lines stood out. Subject C, age unknown. Subject X, age unknown. Both flagged for advanced mimicry and prolonged integration without detection. That's when the floor started shifting again. If Caldwell had been placed into the student body, if he'd been monitoring others, that meant he wasn't the anomaly. He was the control. Someone had put him there to study how the rest would respond. But then, who was X? I went back to the notebook from the barn. The one with the observation logs. Most of the entries lined up with what we already knew. Subject numbers matched student names. Patterns of behavior, resistance, fatigue. But every now and then, a different tone would slip in. Short phrases. X remains unresponsive to conditioning. X is watching me. I do not believe X sleeps. By the last page, the writing had shifted more fragmented. X engages others but mimics without true understanding. X is studying me. I am not in control. Mila stayed late that night going through school enrollment records. She found something I'd missed. Tina Ali, the seventh name on the manifest. Her permission slip was different. No signature. The ink on her name was heavier, as if written later. Every other form had a parent's initials. Hers was blank. Mila checked back through school attendance logs. Tina had perfect attendance that year until the day of the trip. After that, she was marked absent unexcused, then listed as missing. There was never a formal withdrawal, no mention of a replacement student. It was as if someone had swapped a name on a form and counted on no one checking the details. I remembered Tina, small, quiet, always sketching. Sat near the back of the class and watched people more than she spoke. One teacher once told me she could draw someone's face from memory after seeing it once. I thought about her sitting near Caldwell watching him. I thought about how those observation logs started changing right around the point where Subject 7 is noted as resistant. She'd seen something, and maybe that's why she vanished without anyone noticing. Not because no one cared, but because someone wanted it that way. We printed every version of the yearbook photo, compared them side by side. 10 names, 9 photos, and a final page with Eddie's name in faint print. No photo, no quote, and still something missing. We started laying out the evidence again, this time in sequence. The bus, the names, the drawings, the tapes. We were trying to build a timeline, but something kept shifting. Every time we thought we understood what had happened, the outline changed. Like the case itself didn't want to stay still. And then Mila asked a question I hadn't considered. "What if the bus was never meant to crash?" she said. "What if it wasn't an accident or even a disappearance?" She pointed to the map on the wall, the line where the coast road should have ended at the cliffs. What if someone turned the wheel? We both stared at the rusted map pin marking mile marker 17, then at the other pin 40 miles inland where the barn had stood. There had been no trace between them, no sightings, no calls, no wreckage, just 2 points, one vanishing, one buried. And for the first time since we reopened the case, I stopped thinking about who was missing and started wondering who or what had come back. It was close to midnight when I saw it. Mila had gone home hours earlier, but I stayed in the records room surrounded by old maps, planning reports, school district filings, anything that might connect the barn site to the original bus route. I wasn't even looking for names anymore. I was trying to trace footprints' intentions the shape of a plan. That's when I found a zoning request from 1982. It was buried in the back of a utilities folder application for temporary road installation research transport corridor. The coordinates didn't make sense at first. The location wasn't along any known road, but when I overlaid it onto the satellite grid from the time the pieces fell in, a service route, not paved, not listed on any public maps, cut straight from the cliffs near mile marker 17 to the back of a privately leased property in Barrow Hollow. A direct line, 40 miles. Like someone had pre-built the disappearance. I printed it, took it home, spread it across my kitchen table beside the manifest, the photos, the drawing from the concrete wall. I'd started sleeping with the radio on again. Not music, just static. I didn't like the silence anymore. I kept catching myself listening for something. A knock, a voice, even footsteps. But there was nothing, just the hum of the floorboards and the weight of every unanswered question pushing in from the corners. The next morning, I went back out to the cliffs. Not for the view, not for evidence. I wanted to see the road, what was left of it. The section that used to connect to the coast had long since eroded, but if you followed the slope east, just past the old maintenance shack, there was a faint groove in the earth, overgrown but not forgotten. I walked it for nearly 2 miles before I found what I was looking for. A rusted mile marker almost buried in soil. No highway number, no county tag, just a single digit. X. It didn't belong to any department. I called the state registry. They had no record of an X route ever existing. Not here. Not anywhere. Back at the station, Mila had found something too. She was cataloging audio files again, reviewing the distortion reports from the tapes we recovered. She played one for me low-muffled, but underneath the static was something else, a sound like wind but rhythmic. Then a voice, not Caldwell's this time, a girl's, barely above a whisper. He isn't watching anymore. Click. End of tape. No timestamp. No subject number. Just a label scratched into the plastic. Unfiled. Do not duplicate. I asked where she found it. She said it was tucked into the side panel of one of the crates unlogged untagged. Just there. Waiting. I played it again. Slower. The voice didn't match any of the 10 known students. I checked the recordings we had from Rachel, Carla, even Tina. None of them lined up. Mila asked the question I didn't want to say out loud. Could it be Subject X? We didn't answer it, but neither of us stopped listening. That week I started requesting surveillance footage from nearby towns. Not from 1984, there was none, but from the months after. I figured if the bus had been moved, someone had to have seen a transport vehicle, something large, covered. I focused on intersections near Barrow Hollow. Narrow roads, old fuel stops, way stations. Most of the tapes had already been overwritten or degraded, but one dated June 2nd, 1984, still played. A grainy reel from a gas station 15 miles outside of Fog Harbor. A truck pulled in at 2:11 a.m. Box trailer. No plates, no company markings. Driver never exited. A young woman employee on shift logged it as unnatural. She wrote, didn't move, just idled for 8 minutes, like it was waiting. Then at 2:19 a.m. it pulled out, turned onto County Road 13, toward Barrow Hollow. I tracked down that woman. She was retired now, living in Maine. She remembered the night like it had just happened, said she felt cold the moment it pulled in, like the lights flickered, like her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She said she couldn't see the driver's face, but she remembered the silhouette, someone small, narrow. Not a man, she said. Not a boy either. Just wrong. I didn't tell her what I'd found, just thanked her and left. I drove home in silence that night. Turned off the radio, opened the windows. The road was quiet. Empty. I passed the school again, though there was no reason to. I slowed near the old gym. The memorial was still there, crosses still standing. But one had been moved, tilted forward like someone had pressed it hard into the soil. I got out, walked over. It was Brandon Vales. Someone had etched something new into the wood beneath his name. Just 3 lines. He saw. He told. He's gone. Back at my desk the next morning, I laid out the timeline again. May 11th, the trip. May 12th, initial search. May 13, media blackout begins. June 2nd, the transport sighting. June 3, Phase 1 logs end. And then silence. No tape, no footage, no follow-ups. Nothing until the barn discovery nearly 40 years later. That kind of silence isn't natural. Not in a case with 10 missing minors and a statewide manhunt. It meant something had been buried, and not just physically. Records, access, memory. The deeper we looked, the more it felt like the town itself had been scrubbed, not erased, just redirected, like something had taken hold of the narrative and steered it away from the truth. And then, that afternoon, Mila found it, in the margins of a coded project summary behind layers of redaction. The line was small, barely legible, but it changed everything. Phase 2. Initiation pending Subject X still embedded. That word still landed like a stone in my chest. Still embedded. That meant she hadn't vanished. She hadn't been lost. She'd stayed. Or been left. Or worse. She'd chosen not to leave. We didn't know where or how, but she was out there, Living. Walking. Maybe watching. Mila said it first again. What if she wasn't one of the students either? I didn't answer. I just turned the manifest over one more time. And for the first time, I noticed the faintest imprint something once erased, now barely visible. An 11th line. No name. Just the indentation where a signature had been pressed, and then scratched out. The indentation on the manifest stayed with me. It wasn't just the absence of a name, it was the pressure, the shape of something that had once been there. Someone had signed that line, pressed hard enough for the ink to leave an echo, and then, for whatever reason, tried to erase it completely. I had the page scanned, magnified, digitally enhanced. Mila and I spent an entire afternoon in silence, just adjusting shadows and contrast, hoping for a fragment of ink, a letter, anything. We didn't get a name, but we got a date. May 10th, 1984, one day before the trip. The signature wasn't there when the original 10 were added. It came later. Someone inserted themselves at the very last minute, and whoever had erased it knew exactly where to find it. That night I drove out to the Caldwell property, what was left of it. The house was gone lot, flattened, overgrown with salt grass and rusted fencing. There was no posted ownership, no current lease, just a dirt trail leading toward what used to be the back of the lot. I parked off the road and walked in. It wasn't legal, but by that point I didn't care. I followed the tree line for about a quarter mile, cutting through a stretch of pines that hadn't seen foot traffic in years. And then I found it a cellar door, half buried under broken boards and sheet metal. There was no padlock, just a rusted bolt that came loose with one pull. The air that came out was stale metallic, thick with something I couldn't place. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped down. The stairs creaked under my weight. Dirt walls, mold on the beams. But the room itself had been used. Not recently, but not decades ago either. There were marks, boot scuffs, scratches along the concrete, a ring of melted candle wax near the corner. And then just beyond a stack of rotting crates, a chair. Welded steel, bolted to the floor. No restraints, no padding. Just a single chair facing a wall covered in newspaper clippings. Every article was about the bus, the search, the memorials, even editorials accusing the police of giving up too soon. At the center was a photo I hadn't seen before, 8 of the 10 kids lined up in front of the school bus, smiling, waving. Except one wasn't smiling. Near the edge, half-shadowed, stood a girl I didn't recognize. Not Tina. Not Jessica. Short hair. No visible ID. Eyes fixed on something behind the camera. I took the clipping, bagged it, then turned back toward the chair. There was something scratched into the metal seat. 3 words, carved deep. She fooled us. I didn't stay much longer. I backed out of that cellar with my light steady and my breathing low. When I got to the top step, I turned once more just to make sure I was still alone. And that's when I saw it. In the dirt, just beside the doorframe, bare footprints. Not fresh, but not old either. Small, narrow. They didn't lead in or out, just circled. The next morning I met with Mila and laid everything out. The map, the clipping, the footprints. She didn't say much, just stared at the girl in the photo. I watched her eyes move across the image, stop, then backtrack. This one, she said, tapping the edge. We've seen her before. She pulled up the drone footage from the barn site, the figure near the fencing. Same posture. Same build. We couldn't make out the face, but the outline matched. 40 years apart. Same girl, same distance. Still watching. We started going through missing persons archives again. Not just kids. Adults, employees, people who worked in transport, construction, government contracts, anyone who might have had access to that barn, or the road, or the temporary corridor authorization from '82. That's when Mila found a name. Elaine Hart. Contract psychologist for a state-run juvenile unit in northern Maine, Delrest, the same one Caldwell had been tied to. Hired in 1983. terminated in May of 1984 for failure to report protocol deviation. No contact since. Not officially listed as missing, but her personnel file had been sealed without explanation, and on her staff ID behind her shoulder was a blurry reflection in the window. Short hair, narrow face, watching her. We tried to find family. No records, no emergency contact, no DMV entries, Social Security credit reports. Elaine Hart had vanished before anyone thought to ask why, but someone had taken her place, and they'd been inserted into the structure of that unit, maybe longer than anyone realized. That night, I dreamed I was back in the barn. Only the walls weren't concrete anymore, they were mirrors, and in each one I could see the same girl, standing behind every reflection, not moving, just waiting for me to notice. When I woke up, the radio beside my bed was on. I hadn't touched it. Just static. No station. I turned it off. Sat there in the dark for nearly an hour before I moved. The next day, we went back to the school. It had been rebuilt since the 80s, but parts of the old structure remained. The basement level still used for storage. Mila pulled a key from the district office. No resistance, no questions. We said we were following up on the memorial planning. They let us in. The basement smelled of mildew and paint thinner, cinder block walls, low ceilings. We moved slow, room by room. Most were empty. One still held old desks, band uniforms, sports gear. But the last room, the one near the furnace, had a door that stuck. Mila put her shoulder to it. It gave way. Inside was dust cobwebs, nothing unusual at first glance. But on the far wall behind a broken chalkboard was a shape faint but still visible. An outline of a handprint in white. Small, child-sized, not made with paint. More like it had absorbed through the wall itself. Just below it, someone had carved a date into the plaster. May 11th, 1984. I pressed my hand to it. Cold, almost damp. I don't know what I was expecting, but I remember what Mila said as we stood there. She was here, before the trip, watching them, maybe even choosing. That word choosing settled in the space between us. Not taking, not abducting. Choosing, like they were candidates, or parts of something larger. We left the school just as the fog was rolling back in. It wrapped around the building like it had memory. We didn't speak on the walk to the car, just the sound of gravel underfoot and the creak of the old gate behind us. And then as I opened the door, Mila froze. Her hand went to her coat pocket slowly. She pulled out a folded piece of paper. It hadn't been there earlier. She hadn't felt anyone get close, but it was there now. No envelope, no handwriting. Just a typewritten sentence on plain stock paper. Phase 2 has already begun. We didn't speak on the drive back. Mila kept the note folded in her palm like it might vanish if she blinked. I kept watching the side mirrors, not sure what I was expecting to see. Nothing followed us, nothing obvious. But the silence inside the car felt too still, like sound had been pulled out of the air before it could reach our ears. I dropped her off just after 7. She didn't ask to come inside. Just nodded once and walked toward her door, still clutching that paper like it meant more than any piece of evidence we'd found so far. I watched her go inside, waited for the porch light to flicker on. It never did. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed at the kitchen table, surrounded by maps, photos, files, the manifest, the drone footage. Every item was out in front of me like pieces of a puzzle someone had broken just enough to keep the full picture hidden. I went back to the cellar photo, the girl in the newspaper clipping. Same posture, same frame as the figure from the barn site, and maybe even the face in the glass behind Elaine Hart. Over 40 years and not a single confirmed name. Whoever she was, she hadn't aged, or she'd never belonged to that timeline in the first place. By morning, I was back in the archive room. I wanted everything we had on Delrest Juvenile Unit, Old blueprints, intake logs, medical charts. The state had officially dissolved the facility in '89, but their off-site storage was still active under a different shell name, Wellspring Youth Research Initiative. It was a blind lead, but Mila pulled strings with a records tech she'd interned with years back. We got access to one box, labeled 84D3 Transfer. Inside 5 file jackets, 1 VHS tape, and a maintenance keycard with Level 3, Outer written in faded ink across the top. I drove up that night. The original Delrest site had been sold off and gutted, replaced by a state-run addiction recovery center. Same footprint, new coat of paint. The north wing was still intact, though sealed for renovations. I waited until shift change, 11:50 p.m. 2 techs outside smoking by the dumpsters, not watching the side lot. I parked down the hill and hiked up the service path through the trees. The keycard was still active. The rusted door groaned open just wide enough to slip through. Inside was dead air. No lights. Just the soft buzz of old electrical lines still faintly alive in the walls. My flashlight picked up green tile floors cracked and buckled in places. Water damage, flaked paint, the scent of mold and metal. I moved slow, careful with each step. The halls looked untouched. But as I moved deeper, I found one door with scrape marks, repeated entry. Someone else had been here recently. The badge worked again. The lock clicked. The door didn't swing. It unsealed like a vault. Inside was a room lined with filing cabinets and wall-mounted observation windows, 2-way mirrors backed with darkness. A single reel-to-reel recorder sat on the desk. I pressed play. Nothing but static. Then a voice. Male. Measured. Subject X remains nonverbal but demonstrates environmental awareness. Photophobic. Reactive to social conditioning. Imprints selectively. Avoids adult females. Responds to children. Then a pause. Ticking. And another voice, female, barely above a whisper. He didn't close the door. A shuffle. A breath caught on tape. Then the male again. Note: do not permit Subject X near unsecured exits. Previous containment compromised. The tape ended. The reel spun down. I stared at the mirrors, wondering what had been on the other side. I didn't want to open the adjacent room, but I did. And what I found didn't make sense, not even after everything. The room was small, clean. Shelves lined with worn-down books, dolls, a coat rack with a child's parka still hanging, and on the far wall, scribbled in charcoal, was a mural. 10 faces, some smiling, some not, drawn from memory. But each one matched a photo from the bus manifest, each one labeled, except the 11th, off to the side, not drawn fully, just an outline, no name, but a word scratched beneath. She watches. I left the room exactly as I found it. Locked it again. Backed out the way I came. I made it halfway to the tree line before I saw movement near the maintenance shed at the edge of the lot. Someone standing just inside the shadow. I didn't stop walking. Didn't look too long. Just kept going until I was behind the wheel and the road had reappeared beneath me. Mila was waiting when I got home. She hadn't called, hadn't texted, just there, sitting on my front steps holding a folder. Inside was a printout from the National Missing Children's Archive. The file had been updated that morning. New submission, no name. Just a composite sketch added to a cold case tag from 1986 upstate Pennsylvania. A girl spotted walking alone at night near the edge of a wooded neighborhood. No follow-up, no police record. But the face was identical. Mila flipped the page. There were more. 5 states, different years, always unverified. Always the same girl. Then she handed me something else. A voicemail. From the school district administrator. They were following up on our memorial access. She sounded confused. I just checked the roster you used to verify the names. Something's off. Your list has 11. Our official record only ever listed 10. I checked our file. I'd been looking at that page for weeks. 10 names. 1 blank line. But when I turned it over again that night, something had changed. The indentation, the signature that had once been erased, was now written in faint pencil. A name I didn't recognize. Eleanor Hart. I flipped through everything we had. There was no Eleanor. Not in the staff, not in the students, not even in the medical records. But in one of the intake folders from Delrest, tucked into the back cover, was a staff emergency contact sheet. Name, Elaine Hart. Daughter, Eleanor. Listed age at the time, 11. Mila just stared at me. She wasn't watching them, she said. She was among them. I thought back to the mural, the chair in the cellar, the handprint behind the chalkboard, the voice on the tape. Every trace had pointed to an outsider, an observer. But what if she hadn't stayed outside? What if the project wasn't just about disappearance but replacement imprint? I remembered the doctor's voice from the reel. Imprints selectively. I pulled the photograph from the barn site again, counted the shadows. 10 crosses in the dirt, 1 standing beyond them. Not marked, not buried. Watching, still watching. And now, signed. We didn't bring the signature to the authorities. Not yet. Not with the name so faint it could disappear with one wrong breath. Instead, we scanned it, magnified it, ran it through enhancement tools just like we'd done with the manifest. Eleanor Hart. It came back consistent with aged graphite. Not a forgery, not fresh. The stroke depth matched a child's hand. We layered it with the original scan from weeks ago where there'd been only pressure, now there was graphite, meaning it hadn't been erased. It had appeared, later, after someone had touched that page again. It meant the file was still being accessed, not just by us, and not from the outside. Mila and I reached out to a contact at the state attorney's office, someone she'd worked with before. We gave her only the logistics at first. No names, no speculation. Just a simple request: had there ever been an internal investigation into Delrest, especially surrounding child identity, misfiling, or patient-subject overlaps? She didn't answer right away. Then she told us to meet in person. No phone, no email. That's when we knew. We met at a diner on Route 3, just past county lines. She arrived late. No purse, no briefcase. Just a single flash drive and a handwritten note. "Whatever you're in," she said quietly, "they buried it deep. And not just in paperwork." The original complaint, filed in '85 under a false case number, never got processed. It was redirected, not trashed, reassigned to something called Corridor 11. Mila glanced at me. The phrase meant nothing. Yet. The contact leaned in. Corridor 11 isn't physical. It's not a wing, not a department. It's a routing code, used to siphon data that couldn't be officially logged. It leads nowhere. That night I ran the flash drive. There were 6 documents. Scans of handwritten memos, transfer logs, something like medical observation pages, but with most of the names redacted. In one of them, though, the redaction had missed a header. E. Hart, Adaptive Host Parameters Cycle 2. Beneath it, a note in pencil. Secondary imprint successful. Site relocated. The memo was dated June 1986. That was 2 years after Eleanor disappeared. 2 years after Elaine had been terminated. I pulled out the old drone photos of the burial site. I'd always looked at the 10 crosses, the spacing, but I hadn't paid attention to the tree line. In one shot, barely visible beyond the fencing, was a utility box. Not rusted, new wiring, too modern for the site. Mila and I went back that weekend. The ground had dried from recent storms, which gave us clearer footing. We took the trail behind the barn, followed the arc of the fencing until we reached it. The utility box was padlocked, but the soil around its base was uneven, like it had been moved recently. We marked the area, then followed the trail further. Just under 100 yards later, we found it. A storm grate. But it wasn't part of the county system. Mila cross-checked it with the municipal maps. It wasn't listed. Not under any district. No water main. No sewer line. But the pattern on the grate matched a symbol we'd seen in the files. A triangle enclosed in a circle. Corridor 11. We didn't go down that day. We weren't ready. Instead, we filed an anonymous report coded buried inside an unrelated infrastructure complaint, just enough to trigger an inspection. Then we waited. And 2 days later, Mila got a call from the same district admin who'd called about the roster. She sounded different this time. Scared, but calm. "I know I'm not supposed to," she said, but I checked the logs again. The names. There were 11 at one point. But after the trip, there were still 11 entries. One of the parents called, confused, said they'd gotten a letter home thanking them for their child's participation. But their son never went. He'd been home sick. We asked for the name. She hesitated, then gave it to us. Peter Lang. We found the family still living in state out near Fairbury. Retired. Quiet. When we visited, his mother met us at the door. She was wary but kind. Said Peter had gone through something back then. Nightmares. Sleepwalking. Once he'd been found standing in the backyard at dawn barefoot staring at the woods. But he never got on the bus. She was sure of it. Still had the doctor's note from the day he missed school. But when we showed her the photograph from the newspaper clipping, the one from the barn, she froze. "That's him," she whispered. "That's Peter." Mila and I exchanged a glance. "Are you sure?" I asked. Her hand trembled slightly as she took the photo again. "That's his jacket. I remember patching that rip on the left sleeve. But he didn't go." She looked up at me, her eyes hollow. "At least I don't remember him going. We asked to speak with Peter. She said he'd passed away in 2007. Complications from a fall. But when we asked where he was buried, she said there'd never been a formal service. That's when we noticed the urn on the mantel. The nameplate read, Peter A. Lang, but the date of death listed wasn't 2007. It was 1984. We left in silence. Mila didn't say anything until we were halfway back. "What if he did go?" she said slowly, but the real Peter never came back. I didn't answer, because deep down I'd already started to believe that was true. We returned to the storm grate on a Thursday, just after dusk. The lock was gone. No signs of tampering, just removed like someone had opened it from the inside. We lifted the lid. Below, rusted steps disappeared into darkness. A stale current of air rose from below. We lowered ourselves one by one, careful, quiet. The tunnel walls were concrete lined with old wiring and moisture-stained maps. At the base, the air felt heavier, soundless, like the earth itself had gone still. We followed the tunnel for maybe 50 feet. Then we found the door. Steel. Reinforced. No handle. Just a scanner. And beside it, a strip of black glass. Mila raised the keycard we'd used at Delrest. It didn't work. But when I pressed my hand to the glass just to feel the surface, a soft click echoed from the lock. The door opened. Inside, it wasn't a room. It was a corridor. Long, clean, fluorescent lights flickering overhead, and lining the walls sealed behind reinforced glass were cells. Not cages, rooms. Each one empty, except the last. That's where we saw her. She stood in the center, barefoot, wearing a faded blue dress. Her hair was short now, darker. But the face, it was Eleanor. Or what Eleanor had become. She didn't move, didn't blink, just watched us with that same expression from every photo, every reflection. She raised one hand, slow, deliberate, pressed it to the glass. And behind her, scribbled into the wall, were 4 words. This time, I choose. She didn't speak. Not that night. Not in the days that followed. But the look in her eyes that stayed with me. It wasn't vacant or wild like we'd feared. It was something harder to explain. Like she remembered everything but didn't have the words anymore. We alerted the authorities, of course. Mila contacted the state's missing persons task force directly, and within hours the corridor was sealed, the site classified. We were questioned separately, given non-disclosure papers that we never signed. And then, she was gone. Transferred. Moved again. No updates, no case file, no media coverage. Just gone. They told us later that what we found had been part of an old behavioral program unauthorized shut down decades ago. That Eleanor was part of a composite study, not an individual. That she didn't match any missing child records. But we knew. The handwriting, the photos, the mirror, the girl in the glass. That was Eleanor Hart. And if they tried to erase her again, they'd have to do it knowing someone remembered. After the corridor was closed, Mila and I kept digging for a while. Not out of obsession, not anymore, just because we owed it to the names. To the 10 crosses, to Peter Lang, to the families who never got answers. We built a private archive. Scans, maps, witness logs. Nothing sensational. Just truth, or as close as we could get to it. We never published it, never pushed for headlines. That wasn't the point. Some stories aren't meant to be shouted. They're meant to be held. Carefully. Mila moved a year later, took a teaching position back east. We still talk. She sends postcards sometimes, always unsigned. I think it's her way of saying I'm still watching too. As for me, I stayed. I still live a few miles from the woods, close enough to remember, far enough not to dream about it every night. Sometimes when the light hits the trees just right, I think I see her. Not as she was in the corridor, but how she might have looked if none of it had happened. Wind in her hair, bare feet in the dirt. Free. I never found out who left that photo in my mailbox, or why the file appeared when it did, but I stopped needing to. Some truths arrive when you're ready, not before. And some part of Eleanor, whatever was taken from her, found its way back. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the only kind of justice some of these stories ever get. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening, for staying with the names most people forgot. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it. Quietly, so no name and no child ever stays buried.